Okay. So I've done a lot of things in 80 years, and I'm sure you want to hear about them all. We don't have enough time to cover it all. You all know that. So the websites on the opening slide will give you help to root through the record of my work. I should note that I have a smarter older brother named Joe, who was quite famous within the field of evolutionary biology. He wrote and published open source software, which accounts for high web traffic under his name. Thus, searches for Felsenstein will turn up about 4 times as many responses for him as for me. That's life with a little older brother. So if you do a search, put Lee in there. I'm quite proud of him, although I had nothing to do with his success other than to be his first and worst student. People have long commented to me that I don't understand why you're doing what you're doing. This has usually led to my attempt to explain, which always took longer than 90 minutes, and by now it's probably longer. Finally, I decided to write a book about it. There we go. To relieve me of this ancient mariner problem. As you can see, it's about 250 pages long, and a talk that covers it adequately seems to require 3 hours. It's entitled Me and My Big Ideas, subtitled Counterculture, Social Media, and the Future, to distinguish it from many volumes of children's clip arts that share the same main title. The publisher, my first publisher, thought that it was a great idea. Let's make it the main title. And I said, why not? I didn't look it up. Whatever. This will be the famous one. It can be ordered through my Felsensteins.com website. I have a display at booth 2019 showing not only the book, but also posters and other merchandise that I'm trying to monetize this with. They all have QR codes on them, the displays, so you shoot the QR code and you get to my website in the page that will get you to the Zazzle, well, or the book vendor, different pages. So enjoy your search. My web page includes a fairly long explanation of each one. Since this event is all about vintage computers, several of which I've designed, I will use the time to explain how I came to personal computers, how before they existed, and why. That's the interesting question, I think. This is me in September 1963, having just arrived in Berkeley, on the steps of my alma mater, the Oxford Hall Student Co-op, which I came to call home at my time at Berkeley. It turned out to be the right place, although I had never heard of it before arriving. I chose it because it was convenient to my bicycle route. But it turned out to be probably the best place to be because it was not university-approved housing, which meant it had no mandatory adult supervision. The other thing is that a lot of the people there were quite literally adults, being veterans and so forth. Even one divorced father had to find a place for his son to stay. So we could govern ourselves quite well, and none of the hijinks and so forth. It's no Animal House. I came to Berkeley having been accepted at Purdue and Carnegie Tech, as it was known then, but couldn't get any financial aid. That was my fault, but that's not relevant here. Berkeley was my backup, being a state university with lower fees. In that year, my fees were $275 per semester because I was an out-of-state student. In-state students did not have to pay the out-of-state fee. It also had the San Francisco Bay Area with its small but prominent beat literary counterculture, popularized in 1958 as the Beatniks, who mainly stuck to themselves, drinking espresso, writing poetry and literature that offended the local Blue Noses, and participating in occasional local radical political protests. Now, San Francisco area had a strong radical labor movement dating from the 1934 general strike. And many leftist radicals made their homes there. I had learned about it all from a book which, as I recall, was entitled The True Bohemia, which I have been unable to find online. I may be wrong on that title. While I was still in high school, there I learned that UC Berkeley figured as a central focus of nonconformist activity in the area. So that was happy. When I arrived, I soon found and joined a small underground of activists who were always available to engage in protest, as I had been doing in high school. By 1964, the civil rights movement had become a local and not just a Southern phenomenon. There was much local activity around racial discrimination in employment, including large sit-in demonstrations. And then came Freedom Summer, when white students from northern universities were specifically invited to come south to help with voter registration and education leading up to the 1964 Democratic Convention, where a Freedom Democratic Party slate would attempt to have the traditional segregationist parties from Mississippi and Alabama unseated. The intention was to allow northern white students to experience the terrorism and repression that was the ordinary lot of black voter registration activists. 3 men, 2 white and 1 black, were murdered early on, in an attempt to terrorize the registration movement. Student groups who did not go worked to support that effort, along with local anti-discrimination actions. And as the upper left corner shows, there's this fringe of tables existed at the edge of campus where information, leaflets, buttons, and bumper stickers were available. Carpools to demonstrations would often load on the sidewalk there. That was presumed to be the sidewalk in city property, and it had been planned. I mean, a decision had been made to deed it over to the city, but no action had been taken on that decision. And so it was discovered by the people who were offended by the activity that this was university property, and so the local ultra-conservative machine in Oakland put pressure on the university to shut this down. So student groups who did not, oh, I already read that, sorry about that. In the fall semester, the participating students returned to campus like combat veterans shaken by the experience. Their mood was somber, and it was exactly the wrong time for the university to cave to local political pressure and order the students to cease their support activity for the civil rights movement. But that's exactly what they did on September 14th. The entire spectrum of campus political groups, from Maoist communist to Goldwater Republican and anarchist libertarian, came together to oppose the prohibition. They all were using tables. And they quickly determined that since they could not move their tables any further away from campus, they would move them right straight into campus. Center picture. That's very definitely on university property there at Sather Gate. Civil disobedience broke out. Thus began 2 months of demonstrations, negotiations, leafleting, pickets, rallies, and mass self-education. They called itself the Free Speech Movement, abbreviated FSM. It was the most essentially American protest movement I have ever experienced. The demand was summarized by the slogan, "First and 14th or fight." Said since the USC was a public institution, the Constitution, not the administration, held supreme as regards limitation on speech and organizing as an extension of speech. I was away when it started on September 30th, in an engineering work-study job at NASA's Flight Research Center at Edwards Air Force Base in the high desert of Southern California. My security clearance was recommended denied eventually, and I was advised to resign to return to school. They literally told me that their concern was that I might picket the Air Force Base. God knows what might have happened. Keep your nose clean, they told me, and you won't have any trouble getting back in. By the way, I extracted from that experience the conclusion that if you want something not to happen, make sure it gives a bureaucrat a problem. I was a problem. I returned to campus in the second week of FSM and almost totally ignorant of the facts. The press reports in Southern California simply referred to it as a riot. There was a large sit-in that went over a weekend around a police car that had taken someone who was arrested and so forth. Anyway, and it seemed that participants would be in danger of expulsion, as actually happened to several leaders during the unfolding of the events and afterwards. More information on the FSM is available at www.fsm-a for archives.org, the website of the Free Speech Movement Archives, which I founded in 1998. Now, I had to make a fundamental decision between my principles and material security, or what seemed to be the path of material security. And I made the right decision, which I've never regretted. Keeping my nose clean would not be my style. That's me in the picture during the climactic occupation of the administration building, Sproul Hall, in December 1st and 2nd. Almost 800 demonstrators, largely students, were arrested, including me. In this picture, a small detachment of police had just failed to capture our microphones, which we dropped out the second floor window. The amplifiers were downstairs and outside. And we were all shouting, "Go home," in unison. By the way, someone captioned this picture, "Fear," not fear. It's not fear. It's something else, but not fear. They did retreat, but we were all arrested, jailed for a day, and bailed out by our supporters. And then we won. The Academic Senate voted to support our position by a margin of 8-1. The university backed off, and students could do anything on campus that ordinary citizens could do everywhere without threat of punishment. How could this happen? The answer lies in the fact that for 2 months, this body of isolated students and others had drawn together into a community. This picture was taken by me in the FSM central office. It's the phone room, and I call it the point of origin for the social internet. I'll tell you why. A business's phone room would be highly organized for handling incoming and outgoing calls, more routing information to where it needs to go. There would be contact lists, called memos and logs. Procedures would be rigorous because the business's viability would depend upon it. Our phone room, however, was what I call a cross-connect. That's a telephone term for where all the neat wires come together and then they get connected in a jumble of wires. People mostly called in with ideas, questions, requests for help, tips about what was happening, etc. The people in the room tried to match up needs with resources. Whoops, I clicked something and didn't mean to. Or failing that, to post notices of open questions and offers of help on the wall, which was their form of database. As an example, while you may not be able to read it, there's a prominent notice declaring Haircut Central with a phone number. Someone claiming to have barber's training who would give free haircuts to people who had to go out and present about the FSM. We didn't plan that, you know. It is clearly a spontaneous offer, and there's no way to tell how many takers it got. That is a good example of the low-level connections that it takes to form a community. And that's what happened. I had a presentation in January of 1965. I heard a member of the steering committee state that FSM succeeded because, quote, the barriers to communication between people came down and anybody could talk with anybody else about the crisis. So this lateral communication, not hierarchical communication. People found where they could help and volunteered in quantity. Students who operated the services like the art studios and the pool hall took it upon themselves to foster discussion about what was happening and served as valuable aggregators of public sentiment. Going back to the representative executive committee. That's the point of that executive committee. It was the network that went out to the students and back. And it also did perform its function of selecting and sometimes removing people from the steering committee. It wasn't just a pro forma thing, and the hard activists were over here ignoring it. So when it suddenly became necessary to print and assemble a 25-page report overnight to rebut some assertion of our opponents in the administration, we were able to commandeer a sufficient number of mimeograph machines on campus and off to turn it out in one run. I served as one of many couriers, collecting batches of pages to be assembled on the tables of my co-op residence hall, on their dining room. The whole effort was put together overnight, an impossible task for any of the small groups that formed the FSM. I learned from that how coordination is basically an information problem, not one of accumulating resources, which I have a piece of wisdom that I have followed ever since. Whoops. Oh. All this wrapped up on December 10th. When students returned in January of 1965, the scene was unbelievable. Like me, many students had feared that this will end badly, and I did expect to be expelled or otherwise disciplined. Instead, the lid was off and the pot was merrily boiling. Freedom had broken out on campus, and all kinds of people were doing all kinds of things previously not permitted. A group started a new magazine, publishing stories on previously forbidden topics, named Spider, for sex, politics, drugs, and rock and roll. It stirred controversy, as you might imagine, and ceased publication after a few issues, but it prefigured Rolling Stone magazine, whose future publisher was at that time on campus. Coincidence? I think not. Mona Hutchin, a woman who had been a member of FSM's executive committee, went over to San Francisco and took her stand on the running boards of a cable car, was arrested because only men were permitted to do this, and was released when no law could be found that she was violating. And that was the end of cable car gender discrimination. Gives you a little idea of the effect that's spreading out. The atmosphere on campus was like a circus with no ringmaster. An unknown number of students dropped out. Someday someone will research this, because there are records of this, to turn up later in the Haight-Ashbury and similar counterculture communities. Personally, I had discovered an unexpected ability to write. I had been almost unable to write in high school. I wrote an essay on how distributed organization techniques could be applied to the problem of organizing a free university, which was something that was being talked about. Drawing on my experiences witnessing FSM's community-based organizing, something quite out of character for a sophomore engineering student. We were simply not expected to do that. And in fact, I sort of stood in awe of all these brilliant people, graduate students even, who I was in the midst of, who knew all about, were studying exactly how people worked. That's one thing you don't learn in engineering. You know, sociology, psychology, political science, things I couldn't even define. And there came a time, I'm diverting here from my script, when in a state of untrue but possible crisis, they turned to me and said, "Quick, make us a police radio." Well, I knew what they meant. You could have done that in 1939, and somebody's father obviously had known about that. And I tried to explain why you can't, it takes time. And everybody seemingly in unison, it wasn't actually, it was one person, but everyone was watching, came back and said, "Never mind about that, make us a police radio." And I realized at that point that on my strategy of waiting for somebody smarter than me to tell me what to do was not the right strategy. I had to go forth on my own, explore, and put things on the shelf, in effect, so that the next time this happened, I would be able to say, well, you can't have that, but here's what you can have that's almost as good. And that would be reality for them. And that was what engineers do. So the essay that I wrote, the essay drew the attention of someone who was assembling a pamphlet on the free university idea and asked if I would contribute it. Of course I would. The result was a multi-page pamphlet folded and stapled containing several articles, but with nothing more than a blank sheet for a cover due to failed mimeograph technique. Certainly not on my part. I knew how to run mimeographs. My article was in the centerfold. So when the New Yorker's Calvin Trillin opened one up to see what he had, there was my name. So he therefore introduced me to the world as the author of the entire pamphlet. Heady stuff. I decided that this wide open, all is possible scene was what I wanted everywhere, all the time, for everybody. I became a revolutionary who had seen a glimpse of a possible future and determined to apply my skills to realizing it. I then began a search for media technologies that would support development of intentional, decentralized, interconnected communities, that lateral communication. As time unfolded, I became editor and publisher of my dorm's house newspaper, where I did some experimentation in that field by allowing anybody to publish anything they wanted as long as they signed their real name to it. And that did create some controversy, and I had to get involved in that controversy, and I was not removed from the job. I joined the underground press, which at that time was just starting up it started in 1965. This is 66, the Berkeley Barb. It seemed to be speaking to the right section of the population, and eventually left after a number of years, when I realized that the very technology of publication embodied the problem. It was a vertical top-down distribution of the same information to everybody, not the lateral information channels that really nobody ever knows what's all being said. The picture is from 1969. I am in my work clothes as an engineer in Silicon Valley. Look at that hair. Coming to Berkeley on Wednesday nights to do my journalism. That's Jerry Rubin I'm interviewing, co-founder of the Yippies, obviously on the subject of the Chicago 7 conspiracy trial. Yes, I was incongruous, and as things got even hairier, one of the hairy ones asked me, "How do you do it, Lee? How do you move between two worlds?" To which I answered, "Don't you know there's only one world?" I began to explore the new countercultural referral services known as switchboards, direct descendants of the phone room of the FSM, each one of which handled a specific interest area. If they could be technologically enabled to share data, then something might be possible, I thought. At my job, I learned about software, computers, and the highly private networks that could interconnect them at that time. I mean, there was no internet then. I guess there was an ARPANET somewhere, but that was totally invisible. And suddenly it struck me that what I had been seeking would be a network of computers. But then where was I going to get a computer? This was 1970, or let alone a network. Well, it turns out I was not alone. Others had been working to set up a computer capability for the counterculture. I joined their group in San Francisco, Resource One. The Project One is where it was located. It's sometimes called a technological urban commune, but it wasn't a commune because it wasn't united in its economics. I joined their group in San Francisco to provide engineering assistance installing a time-sharing mainframe computer. A little part of which you can see between. Is that correct? No, that's from inside. That the picture with me and my one-time girlfriend is with the tape drives. Where was I? Installing a time-shared mainframe computer they had wheedled out of the business establishment that urgently wanted to know what this counterculture stuff was. It turned out to be the very same piece of iron used by Dr. Doug Engelbart in 1968 to perform the mother of all demos. We didn't know that at the time. By demonstrating in real time the personal use of computers, graphic user interface, tactile manipulation of elements through mouse, text entry and list creation, sorting and printing was all there, meaning at the demo. We didn't have it at the place where we got the computer. The video output elements weren't part of this, but the computer was the same. In that process of the demo, engineers and programmers like myself had our minds changed about the potential of computers. And I was able to thank Engelbart about this at one point at a forum where he attended. When I joined the group, Resource One, that's interesting, it says slide. Let me try the next one. Okay, well, I discussed what I wanted to do in developing a database of shared resources that people could access for their own purposes. And they agreed with it. After graduation, I moved into the building, worked hard at maintaining and expanding the computer and bringing in other people. Our first public terminal on this project, which I headed, called Community Memory, a walk-up bulletin board open to all, debuted in Berkeley on August 8th, 1973. So we have this is a picture of a terminal. And another terminal opened in San Francisco at the Mission branch of the San Francisco Public Library a few months later. People took to it well because it did not force them to use preset index words. And they could create their own. The infrastructure for adding and searching started with the instructions, pardon me, I'm not reading with these glasses well. So the instructions for adding and searching started with think of a word. Now that's not the way you set up a business system. But we weren't a business. I like to say that we opened the door to cyberspace and found that it was hospitable territory. You can buy a poster with that slogan on it and this picture downstairs. But working with slow, noisy teletype printing terminals was not feasible. Not in the long run. You can see there's a teletype inside that box, Model 33, and I built the box myself. You'll see a little fan on it down there because you got to remove the heat. But we got it rather colorfully lettered and so forth. We needed video display terminals where they could be rented, but they cost a lot, and they presented a maintenance problem, which we experienced the first time we did rent one. Somebody dropped, the maintenance guy, the maintenance technician dropped a keyboard on the floor, and in those days, the logic chips were made of little sandwiches of ceramic material, and the lid popped off of one of them, exposing the chip. And someone else, if I had been there, I'd be on the ceiling at this point. One of our people said, "Isn't that going to be a problem?" And the tech said, "No, it'll work fine." Until the chip degraded. I like to, okay, we've done that. Oh, there we go. Or accidentally got the right slide. The next month, an article appeared in an electronic hobbyist magazine promising a solution. The TV typewriter, abbreviated TVT, worked with a standard TV to display text characters typed on a keyboard. The article said that it could be used as a computer terminal. The construction plans were too big to print, but they could be had for $2 with a self-addressed stamped envelope. The magazine expected 20 responses. 10,000 letters came pouring in, each with $2. And when I discovered that, I knew something big was happening. I called it the opening shot of the personal computer revolution. It turned out that the TVT was complex, difficult to build, and harder to debug. And even then would only display 32 characters per line. TV bandwidth limited it to that. Worse yet, it operated in page mode, in which the next character after the final one on the screen would cause the screen to blank and continue a new screen from the top. At least the paper teletype would leave the paper behind with what's printed on it. This would not. Don Lancaster, the designer, told me in a phone conversation that he would use random access memory for his next design, which I don't think he ever did. The serial shift registers that he had used required far too much logic to keep track of the position of the cursor and the character in question. This stimulated my own design thinking about what my version might be. And then there was the problem that our terminals had to operate unattended in public venues. How to prevent vandalism and provide necessary maintenance support. I fumble with the page here. I'm building the suspense. While I was considering this, I received a call from my father to inform me of a new book that he had discovered. Now, this is the first time, and maybe the only time he ever did this. A philosopher named Ivan Illich, a former Jesuit priest who had left the order and moved to Mexico to study learning among the poor, had published a small book describing how radio had entered Central American villages. Illich found that after 2 years after the first radio arrived, that's not what I want. It's a space bar. 2 years after the first radio arrived, each village had someone who could repair the radio. Where had they come from? The vacuum tube radios, after 2 years, you were guaranteed to have a tube burn out. Well, it turns out they were always there. They were the people who would investigate anything new and learn by doing and asking, which Illich called vernacular learning rather than institutional learning, which he was opposed to. He wrote a whole book called Deschooling Society. It's more than I will sign up for, but an interesting book nonetheless, which ended with a suggestion that, which is clear to sort of tacked on. He had been apparently visited MIT and been shown the wonders of 16-bit mini computers then arriving. And he decided that possibly computers could be useful in generating learning webs of people with interconnections, which is essentially kind of what we're doing. So this reminded me of how I had learned electronics starting at 11 years of age. I read a few books, which are really manuals for kit construction, figured out what a schematic diagram was, how it related to the pictures in the book. And I began taking apart radios and TVs. Fortunately, my father assisted me in finding a mound of radio and TV chassis in some store backyard. And so I dismantled them all. Won't go into that in detail here. I generally had or wanted no access to formal instruction working with the friends because under the tutelage of my older brother, in which I was always the loser, I did not want to expose myself as not knowing something. I am the world's oldest aspiring wunderkind. You know, the little kid who amazes everybody with how smart he is. Haven't got there yet. Now, I was also gifted a cast-off correspondence course set of instruction booklets. So in a way, I did have some instruction, but it was no person attached to it. I don't think I had the right to send them in and get graded. So I realized that the technology had to be designed to keep people, not to keep people out, but to survive letting people in. Solid-state radios would not have survived the vernacular learning process. Semiconductors were too quick to burn out when mistreated. Vacuum tube internals might turn red hot, but generally survive such a much wider range of abuse. And anybody who's came up with vacuum tubes, experimenting with them, has experienced this. I concluded that terminals or other digital devices could be designed to be explorable and reconfigurable, learning devices as well as functional devices. I distilled my thinking into the following statement. In order to survive in public operation, a piece of computer equipment must be designed to grow a computer club around itself. You can also get a poster with that on it. Illich used the word conviviality to describe such a relationship. Now, I don't know whether, let me check to see if, yeah. I developed an engineering specification I called the Tom Swift terminal, which described a personal computer that could be expanded from a terminal through plug-in cards using a bus architecture, which is comparatively new because bus architectures won't work over more than like 18 inches due to signal propagation times. And computers are just coming down to that size. So those mini computers from DEC and so forth were hot things because in part they had bus architecture and you could just plug cards in anywhere and the addresses would be recognized, and so forth. Like the TVT's design, random access memory would, unlike the TVT's design, the random access memory would decouple the processes of writing incoming data and reading display data. I mean, it started out with, I don't know if you can read it, this display. Yeah. Everything's central to memory. There's no processor card here. We've got an input card and a display card. Now, they generate addresses, in this case, where to write the memory, to place it in the right place on the screen, where to write the data. And the display card is grinding out sequential addresses to access it, basically through direct memory access to get to the screen. No processor. You couldn't afford them. The 8080 at that time cost $350 in single quantities. Okay, and so because, let's see, the TVT was slow because the two processes of writing and reading data had to happen simultaneously because it was all tied to where the beam was on the screen. That character was the only one time you could access it. You had to wait a 60th of a second for it to get around to the next one. So in my design, memory was the central element, not the CPU. Whoops, there's it. Sorry. I just told you what I'm going to say here. So I typed it up and mimeographed it on my desktop publishing mimeograph and sold copies for 25 cents to the small group of oddballs who were discussing personal computers in 1974. We were holding potluck dinners, I think, every Wednesday down in Menlo Park, and a lot of strange and interesting people showed up there. Many of them were working in the field. But of course, the people to whom this stuff appealed was people who could not get access to computers in their everyday life and their jobs. And so that was the allure of personal computers, this concept that did not yet exist. The Tom Swift terminal never got built because the Altair 8800 kit was announced in late 1974, unleashing another torrent of orders and energizing people to form companies to support it by making plug-in cards that it would need. Bob Marsh, fellow with the mustache there, who shared a garage workshop with me, started Processor Technology Corporation, to which I provided engineering help on contract. So that's me with a cup. And the guy with the long hair to the left of Bob is Steve Dompier, an important person. I hope I will get to talk about him here. He was basically their software guy. And well, again, there's a long set of stories. It's in the book, by the way. But early on, he offered to pay me to design the Tom Swift terminal for them, but it has to be done our way. He said, well, I didn't have any money. I did so. And it became the VDM1 video display module. I included the capability to run it without a processor. So basically, I designed, if I remember the previous, let's try this, yeah. I designed, I guess, the display card part of it, which included memory on the card, but not that input card. So I did another design of that, built one of them. It worked fine as a standalone terminal. It was used by the Community Memory Project in development and became the property of the Computer History Museum as when they talk about the VDM1, they say, here's what the VDM1 looked like. Well, there was a VDM1 wire wrap board in there, and then there was another one and no explanation of what you're looking at. I just described that, what I was going to read here. And that is how I created the first social media system and invented the personal computer. Except that a lot of other people participated in these developments along parallel paths. So no one person invented the personal computer. But I can define personal computer so that I'm the one who did it. Yeah. That's, if you control the definition, you've got something. This picture was taken in 1985, showing me posing with my creations to that date. The wire-up VDM1 prototype with the, as you can see, the one that's not in a neat case. The Pennywhistle 103 kit modem next to it, which I designed in 1973 for use at Community Memory because we wanted to have a modem that would output data that came off of cassette tape. Now, I had worked at Ampex for 4 years, and I knew how crummy tape was, especially cassettes. And so I figured out a way to make the thing self-adjust to the incoming data by cheating. That's the way you do these things. By relying on the fact that serial data always goes back to the marking condition between every character. So I used that as a reference point. And if it didn't see that, it would slowly adjust its reference point. And it was quite reliable. Also, easy to build and get working because you'd had no critical adjustment. Okay, there's also in this picture the Sol 20 on the left. Then the Osborne 1 on the right. And under that is perhaps the rarest computer I've ever done that got out somewhere. The European micro expander computer. A Swedish guy showed up and he wanted me to design him a CP/M-based equivalent of an Apple II, but not really 60. If it was CP/M, it wasn't going to be 6502. And I did that, and I had to bring in Bob Marsh later because I became committed to design the Osborne 1 and wouldn't be available. 200 units were built. He couldn't pay for them. I guess he was able to pay for 10. They tried to work with me to sell them off somewhere, but I couldn't generate any enthusiasm. The video in it was color, but it was a European PAL, phase alternate line, a European standard. It wouldn't work on our sets. So they junked 190 of them, and all that exist are 10. And in this case, this picture, well, that's when I had one available. In 2018, I participated in the Vintage Computer Festival in Rome, Italy. It's a Vintage Computer Festival Italia, where they had this as a big poster, and somebody had an expander that I could autograph. So I know that one of the 10 is autographed, and somewhere in Italy. Okay. I tell this story in much more detail in my book, and they proceed into the future in the final section. The last 6 chapters are basically a tutorial. They repeat many of the historical points of information. It's written to be published as a separate publication at some later date. Laying out a theory of group public communication, analyzing existing social media, and defining the next generation that I have already started to design. I now have a multi-page description of its operation. I'm not qualified to write a software specification, so I'm going to be working with other people to do that. So though I love designing hardware, smartphones have solved so many of the problems we have anticipated for the future community memory system that I'm designing the UI for an open source code to run on the major smartphone types. Its operating metaphor will be the book. And in my book, you will see why I contend that we are stuck with the papyrus scroll for our metaphor of information presentation. I'll leave it for you to find out why. I'm not going to waste time in cutting down my book sales. It will support conversations, both two-way and multi-way, which is really the point. Conversations in public space. So everybody involved can see any of the conversations and create their own. With no algorithms. that function will be performed, ta-da, by people who have, the type of person who's the person who always has a suggestion as to where you can go to look for something. We run into these people. Well, we want to provide them with a place they can not only exercise that, but they can actually make some money doing it. The thing will have its own micropayment system built in with credit. And there will also be people who habitually tell other people about what they see. And this will be called the journalists. There was a German professor, Porkson, who published a book called Digital Fever not long ago. He contacted me to write an introduction to the English version and told me to look at a particular paragraph where he had come up with the idea that what's wrong or what's missing with social media today is journalism. And I was stunned to realize I had already thought of that but never done anything about it. I thought, yeah, well, we'll have to have this inspectorate group that just goes around looking at things and reports but doesn't have any power to do anything about it. Journalism. And here I'd, quote, worked as a journalist. Well, so stay tuned. As I say, watch the skies. This is one of my posters. This is an interesting little cultural flip here. And questions are now in order. Yes?
When you designed the Song 20, what was the backstory there?
Well, again, you can read it all in the book, but be brief about it.
Which I've already ordered, by the way. It's on its way.
Good for you. Take heart. That as an example. In 1975, I guess it was, Popular Electronics magazine was apparently negotiating with some company that had a intelligent terminal product. I don't know which one it was, but there were like two of them. IGC, I think, was one. And it fell through. So Les Solomon, the technical editor of Popular Electronics, who brought the Altair in, he was the go-to guy there, told Bob Marsh that if he could do an intelligent terminal product, they would put it on the cover of the magazine. And so I was asked to design a computer around the VDM1. And I just finished designing the VDM1. And I got to work on it, and by maybe February of '76, the schematic was ready. But the point of that was they weren't going to they're going to design it as a general purpose S100 computer. But they weren't going to tell Les Solomon this. Because for some unknown reason, I know the reason, but it's so stupid. They thought that, well, if he knows that it's a computer, it'll compete with the Altair, and he won't, put it on the magazine because he wouldn't, popularize a competitor's product. Didn't know how business worked. Didn't know how magazines worked. There came a moment when I was delivering it in New York to Popular Electronics when Les Solomon, who was a very sharp guy, noticed the S100 connector in there, and he says, "Isn't that an S100 connector?" "Yes." "What would prevent me from putting in," he said, "a byte saver," whatever it was, plugging in boards and running BASIC? Well, I was under strict instructions not to tell him that it was a full computer, but all I could say at that time was, "Beats me." And then he wanted to know, where are you going to put your advertising? Well, I didn't know anything about that. And finally said, and after he yelled at me, I said, "I don't know." But the point of it is, it was the best outcome for him. He now had two competing products advertising in his magazine. That's all he wanted. And so it all worked out. And we named it after him. Beyond that, I could talk for a long time on it, don't want to. It's in the book. That's why I wrote it. Who else? Questions? Yeah.
Because we're here in Dallas, did you ever have any interaction with people at Texas Instruments during this era?
No, not really. I mean, that we were nobody. We were all nobody at the time. Even Mitz with the Altair was nobody. They were a little storefront in Albuquerque, next to a laundromat. And their product, well, when Bob Marsh saw the magazine article, like that would have been for January of 75, so it was about November of 74, the end of November that he got a hold of it. He came running to me and he said, look, there's nothing inside this. It's just a processor and some memory. They don't have any input-output boards. They don't have any expansion boards of any kind. They're going to need all sorts of boards, and I'm going to start a company to build them. And we need help, so you can help me, which I did. So any interaction we would have with a chip manufacturer would go through local sales representatives. How many are you going to buy? But that's it. No, we were not. People have the idea that Silicon Valley is like a big Mount Olympus, and there's a circular table on the top with all of the gods sitting around, and they throw lightning bolts down into the valley and so forth now and then. And so they say to me, "Oh, you were around then, so you certainly must know Roger, this, that, Gordon Moore, and so forth and so on," which of course I didn't. I was one of those little dots moving around down in the valley. Well, Silicon Valley is not built like that. Never was. It's a field full of molehills, each one a company. And between the molehills are the bars and grills where you would go out and have your lunch and talk with your colleagues. And after work, if you were, didn't have a family, you would go there and drink beer and talk. And when you got fired or left your company, you could come back and meet your colleagues there, recruit them for your new company, also get ideas from them and so forth. And it was that's called a third place. It isn't work, it isn't home, it's the third place. The book also explains this. So that's what made Silicon Valley run, and not, being among the high and the mighty. So the Texas Instruments, though they weren't local, they were very high and very mighty, which is the reason why there was no communication between us. They had no reason to talk to us. So, more questions?
How did the community memory terminal get in the library? Was someone there interested in it? Did they want it? Did they tolerate it? How did that happen?
Well, it was installed in a record store that the student government had established in order to drive down record prices. And so they owned it. So I just made an appearance in front of the Student Government Council, introduced the idea, and we just want to put it in there. It won't cost you anything. And they said, "That's great. Go ahead and do it." That's it.
The San Francisco Library.
Oh, that somebody who worked in that library was involved with Resource One. I never really knew I never even saw that terminal. And so they arranged, he's one of these, sounds like a great idea, let's do it. And nobody was looking over his shoulder. So we were able to put it on the counter there. And it ran in 3 different incarnations with a great big gap between number 2 and number 3. No, number 1 and number 2. There's, again, stories in the book. I don't have time to go into it here. I got to tease you with something. But that's the level of organizational coordination. Sounds like a great idea. Go ahead. Yes?
On the previous slide, on the SAL 20, I wonder if you know the origin of that quote on the sticker.
Yes, that says, plug in the, let's see.
Pull out
Pull out
the guts.
the guts and plug in, screw in the brains or something like that. It's from an advertisement we saw.
Okay.
And
That's the only place I found it was in an advertisement for a replacement board for a deck writer.
I don't know.
Intertech. It must have caught on in those circles or something.
Yeah, I mean, it came from
Had an origin before that ad.
the person I brought in as the systems programmer for the computer, Ephraim Lipkin, now dead. It came through his side, his group. So I can't give you any more details. But yes, you found some reference, and it's probably it. And somehow I like to autograph computers with that phrase, but I can't explain where it came from, what I'm talking about. It's really the personality module, because they could not assure themselves of a steady source of any one particular EEPROM chip. And so my solution was put it on a little board and a plug, and you can have different versions that use different chips, which there are. And it also, you can change the personality of it that way, and we did.
Jives with that ad I found, which is changing the personality.
There we go, yeah.
Probably took it from you.
Yeah, they did, and so I was happy to have them. It sold computers. Yes.
Sorry. You talk about third places, and I wouldn't be surprised if you talk about how social media has become the new third place in a way. But wouldn't the movement now, would it be to just advance social media to make it more of a, that lateral third place, but keep it in the digital world? Because I feel like
Well, that's what I'm talking
in the
about.
physical world, that innate human desire is still there. So
Absolutely.
is there a way to still foster that with what you're talking about?
Well, absolutely. That's what I'm trying to do. That's my life work. And this version that I call CM4, I don't think I'll call it community memory, because it isn't much of a memory, because the information fades out, rather like conversations do. They are evanescent. Just the fact that they survive for some period of time is an advancement. But the key to it all, as I have determined, and the book tells you why, is the support of, again, conversations, whether individual or group, in a public space. That public space part is really important. And it's virtual public space as well as physical public space. So that is my solution to that question. Now, let's try it out and see. And so it's digital, sure. It's not analog. But it won't be connected to the internet, except at the back end. And in this case, in its first incarnation at least, it will be running on co-located equipment within the telephone exchanges. Because one of the big problems that we foresaw was security. And the phone system has got that solved. Also identity, ubiquity. I should have this all memorized. Identity, ubiquity, and something else. It's in the book. So some people are going to say, well, why are you using the phone system? You have to pay them, right? And yeah, you have to pay. You don't get everything for free. And in fact, if you're getting something for free, you are the product. And they're getting something for free from you, which comes out to the attention economy that Michael Goldhaber invented the term. Someone we actually were talking with back at the beginning. Anyway, enough name dropping. Any more questions? I think we're at an hour here. What's our time? Anybody? It's 1:30, but I can keep going if it's possible. I'm just not supposed to.
I was wondering if you had anything in the book about a whole Earth catalog or anything like that.
Yes, there's something in there. I remember walking past the storefront that the Whole Earth catalog occupied in Menlo Park and think, if only we could tell them what we were doing with community memory. These guys know where everything is at. Now, I've become a friend of Stuart Brand and many of the people in the Whole Earth universe, and they started the WELL, W-E, Whole Earth, L-L, electronic link, which is where I met my future wife, and in fact, when they started the well, they first consulted with me about it, and the next thing I knew, I was member number 3, without ever having asked for it, with a coveted three-letter user ID, Lee. The only 2 earlier were MCM, Michael McClure, and SBB, Stuart B. Brand. So I guess I'm pretty well known there. And not that I knew everybody involved. But yeah, it was one of the inspirations. So they were doing that kind of social media. You could call the Whole Earth Catalog social media. They did want to solicit readers to send in reviews and so forth. They wanted that in feedback path, but it was still printed media. So it was part of it. And yes, I do describe that. So one more question, if we have it, or have I shut everybody up? All right. Okay, looks like that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.